primary ignition.
Are you all right? What's wrong?
I felt a great disturbance in the force, as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in terror.
Yeah, over 7 million souls cried out in terror when they tried running 3D on their new multimedia accelerator from SIS in 1997. And many more would later when the company used the same core in their widespread chipsets with integrated graphics. In this episode, we take a look at the most sold and successful graphics chip released by SIS, the creatively named 6326. In keeping with tradition, we'll start with a quick look at the company's history. Silicon Integrated Systems is headquartered in Taiwan and was founded in 1987. Unlike most of its competitors at the time, they're still active today, though not in the graphics market. The company's most famous and successful products were motherboard chipsets sold in the value segment. Besides graphics, they also made various networking, audio, and USB controller chips. Information regarding their earliest graphics chips is nearly non-existent, but the first one was likely the 86C12, a classic low-cost Hercules clone with 64 kilobytes of memory released in 1988. Next year, it was followed by the 86C14, an elusive card with CGA support, and one which sadly isn't pictured online anywhere, aside from a brief mention in the chip spec documentation. There was also the 86C16 with more universal support for video modes, combining both the Hercules and CGA standards in one. The next model up in their naming convention was the 86C22, which was a more integrated and thus cheaper alternative to the 86C12, again with only Hercules mode support. Despite the name, however, the 86C22 seems to be older than their CGA cards. According to the FCCID database, it actually came out in 1988, either coinciding with or releasing only a few months after the 86C12. SIS, as far as we know, skipped the VGA and VL bus era of cards after that, jumping right into the low-cost SVGA GUI accelerator market with the 86C201 in 1994. Similar to cards like the much more popular S3 Trio line, they usually had at least 1 MB of memory, expandable to 2 MB. It was later renamed through later driver releases to the 6201, so as to fit in with their later naming scheme. In 1995, that new naming scheme would debut with the 6202. The difference between it and the 6201 aren't known because no datasheets still survive for the 6201. What we do know is that the 6202 was a 32-bit GUI accelerator with support for up to 4 MB, but no manufacturer actually bothered with the expense of a full memory configuration. As such, cards with the newer chip were released with only 1 MB on board, upgradable to 2 MB just like its predecessor. Later that same year, the 6205 was released with a later revision in 1996 sporting video overlay and scaling support. The 6205 used a 64-bit core this time alongside a 64-bit memory interface, and even the ability to use shared system memory when using an SIS chipset. Once again, 2 MB was typically the maximum amount of memory despite its support for 4 MB. The 6215 followed that in 1997 as a stripped-down, low-cost variant of the 6205. Shared memory and video overlay support were removed, and the cards dropped the unused support for 4 MB memory. The 6215 ended up being SIS's most popular 2D graphics card. And then the 6225 released as an actual upgrade over the 6205 with support for hardware and PEG-1 video decoding. It was likely released in 1996, although manufacturer support for the chip seems to have been limited as we couldn't find a single photo of a card utilizing it. Phew. But now we finally get to the reason we're all here. In late 1997, SIS released their first 3D accelerator, named the 6326. Now, SIS weren't fools. They knew they couldn't compete amongst the latest high-end offerings lighting up all the headlines, so instead they marketed the 6326 as a multimedia accelerator. In other words, a low-cost, low-end graphics card akin to the S3 Verge and Trio 3D, as well as ATI's Rage 2. The chip was very competitively priced as such and accelerated 80% of the MPEG-2 decoding process, as well as supporting 3 different memory types and even the new AGP2X bus standard. No wonder it became a favorite choice among many well-known and lesser-known card makers alike. By the end of 1998, SAS announced they had sold over 7 million 6326 chips, and that wasn't even the end. Chip production continued until at least the year 2000, and the 3D Core was implemented into various SAS chipsets as an integrated graphics solution. Pricing at the time is hard to find, and we only found one listing for a Diamond Speedstar A50, priced at only $45 for a 4MB model in 1999. The earlier chips weren't without their bugs and issues, and SAS released many revisions. The earliest ones were C1 and C3 revisions containing texture bugs and likely limited to 4MB of memory. The later C5 revision corrected those issues and is the one we use for testing. In 1998, there appeared another D2 revision known as the 6326 DBD, which had added Macrovision support. The last and most common revision was H0, also released in 1998, known as the 6326 AGP. Near the end of this video, we'll show you the results in a few games comparing different revisions just to see if there's any difference between them. The H0 card shown here is an example of how many no-name brands crippled their cards with only 4MB of memory on a 32-bit interface, and that's not even the worst case scenario. Some cards even used EDO memory clocked at only 56 MHz. Our card of choice for testing is the late model AOPEN PA50V, released in 1999 and sporting high clock speeds with its memory running at 90 MHz. This is nearly the fastest model available, with the only faster model being the Diamond Speedstar A50 configured with 100 MHz memory. Our card uses the AGP bus, has beta support for OpenGL, and came at a price that is unknown, sadly. It's safe to say it was under $100 though. SAS only specified a pixel fill rate in its specs, nothing about its texel rate. Still, with up to 50 megapixels per second, it's actually quite good for the time, considering that the original Voodoo accomplished all that it did with the same theoretical fill rate. Our reference card we'll be comparing it to is, as always, the 3DFX Voodoo 1 from Diamond, with 4MB of memory at 50 MHz, though keep in mind this card was much more expensive back in its day. And because our test PC is occasionally too fast for a Voodoo 1, we also used an NVIDIA Riva 128 card clocked at 100 MHz in its place for direct 3D games whenever color issues occurred. Drivers for the SIS 6326 were version 1.22 from AOPEN and were actually only recently rediscovered. They're dated to the year 1999 and have the same option screens as seen in official SIS OEM drivers. Like other multimedia and early 3D accelerators, they're missing anything even remotely close to 3D settings. There are only 3 driver tabs allowing you to change the resolution and refresh rate of your monitor, video brightness and contrast, and gamma correction for screen colors. Nothing's available for 3D, and we can't even disable wait for VSync, which thus affects results for lower resolutions like 320 by 240. The last driver available from SIS released in 2002, while we aren't using it because of one simple reason. SAS never officially supported OpenGL on the 6326. AOPEN's driver is actually the only known driver with working OpenGL support, at least in Windows 9X, and thus it allowed us to test Quake. Final Reality's options screen looks very promising. All technologies are supported, unlike most older competing chips. And quite honestly, the rendering quality isn't bad. We really don't see any real graphical faults whatsoever. The frame rate isn't great, of course, at less than half of the Voodoos, but we wouldn't call it a slideshow either. In 3D Mark 99, the performance of the 6326 is honestly pretty good. It's only a few frames behind the Voodoo and PCX2. Of course, the textile fill rate falls well short of the more expensive cards, but it sits atop of the other low-end offerings. In the racing test, we do see a rendering issue in the sky, with colors blown out compared to our reference Voodoo. In Tomb Raider 2, the game is mostly playable with higher contrast rendering when compared to the Voodoo. Later, when we get to Lara's mansion, you can see some rendering issues with dark lines along polygon seams, particularly noticeable on Lara's arms. Forsaken looks decent with correctly rendered alpha blended textures, which many budget cards struggle with, although the texture filtering quality is more blocky on those transparent textures than on the Voodoo. Unfortunately, the frame rate is only a third of the Voodoo's, which is honestly less than playable in a fast-paced game like this. Shadows of the Empire doesn't detect fog tables, but quite honestly the game seems to render just fine, and with a playable frame rate. Unfortunately, Fraps has trouble with this game, so ignore the odd numbers that show up from time to time.
No problem for our blaster.
Warhammer Dark Omen looks mostly fine except for the unit sprites, which have broken alpha channel rendering. The frame rate is sadly very low in this game, though in a strategy game like this we could imagine a user on a budget tolerating it as much as possible back in the day.
Enemy sighted! They're heading for the trading post. Let's spill their green blood. Aye, sir. Open fire! Target received. Aye, sir. Aye, sir. Open fire! Open fire! Target received. Engage.
Moto Racer is one of the best showings for the SIS chip. Aside from some lesser quality bilinear mip mapping, rendering is almost spot on, and the frame rate is pegged at 999. Or that's actually Fraps having issues again, but you can clearly tell the game is running smoothly, and the experience overall on this card is very pleasant. Croc could probably stand to be a little smoother running, but anyone used to platformers on the Nintendo 64 probably wouldn't mind. Otherwise, we can't really complain about how it runs on the 6326 here. Subculture continues the positive trend with no rendering issues and a frame rate most gamers in 1997 or 1998 would have been fine with. Turok renders a little too dark, although you could tweak that if you wanted to. More concerning is the frame rate, which just isn't good. Owners of this card would probably want to stay away from this title. Wing Commander Prophecy mostly renders fine, although you can see some ugly lines in the lens flare effect. The frame rate can dip pretty low during firefights, and you can see in the options menu that the fog option is unavailable.
Looks like the kids had one hell of a party. Too bad we missed it.
They're here. Somewhere. Count on it. All clear. Nap time.
You want your backs. Okay, we've docked into Cruiser Alpha Wing.
I have a very bad feeling about this. I have a very bad feeling about this.
The engagement area is entering this is 1. The area of engagement area is cleared with dead cats. Confirm the location of ship's auxiliary log. Downloading. Confirm the location of ship's auxiliary log. Downloading.
Whoa, heads up, please. We got company. We got company.
Where the hell did they come from? Those aren't killers. Those are fighters.
Alpha Wing, we're taking fire. We're bugging out. Alpha Wing, we're taking fire. We're bugging out.
Crap. All craft, break and attack. All craft, break and attack.
Marine 1 dusting off. Marine 1 dusting off.
Reinforcements. Eat your heart out, Blair.
Reintroduced. Maestro, you're dead.
Not bad, Rookie.
Did you see that? Bring it on.
Incoming runs pretty slow, and the text and logo are noticeably poor looking next to our reference card. This might have to do with the inferior bilinear filtering quality with transparent textures that we noted earlier in Forsaken. Carmageddon 2 is much the same, with bad-looking text graphics and poor performance. It's a slaughterfest for both pedestrians and your frame rate. Shogo looks quite different, with a missing fog effect which makes colors stand out a lot more. The frame rate is around half of the reference card, and the game is clearly much too strenuous on this card to be usable. Wipeout isn't a good time either on the 6326. In a game like this, you need a smooth frame rate. You know it's bad when the Saturn version of the game runs smoother. In MDK's Direct 3D Features test, the Lines test fails to render anything, and overall the performance of the Voodoo 1 is 5 times better. In-game though, the framerate is nonetheless playable, although there is an annoying issue with the cursor hourglass showing in the middle of the screen. Normally this can be fixed by switching to the desktop and back, but in this case doing so crashes the game. Another option is to run a different resolution between the desktop and the game, which we can't show due to an issue it causes with our capture card. The filtering quality around the edges of the main character is once again much blockier than the reference card. Half-Life has some occasional rendering issues with some flashing polygons and lines, and the frame rate is stuck in the teens most of the time, making the game too sluggish for the task of crowbarring some aliens.
The time is 8:47 a.m. Current topside temperature is 93 degrees, with an estimated high of 105. The Black Mesa compound is maintained at a pleasant 68 degrees at all times. This train is inbound from Level 3 dormitories to the Sector C test labs and control facilities. If your intended destination is a high security area beyond Sector C, you will need to return to the Central Transit Hub in Area 9 and board a high security train. If you have not yet submitted your identity to the retinal clearance system, you must report to Black Mesa personnel for processing before you will be permitted into the high security branch of the transit system.
And now we get to one of the more interesting tests, GL Quake. Now keep in mind, under normal circumstances, this game doesn't run at all, as most drivers for this card don't support OpenGL. AOpen's driver makes this at least possible, but as you can see, 640 by 480 is just too many pixels for the lowly 6326. Your only option is 320 by 240, which makes this card only marginally better than software rendering on a period correct CPU. Oh, and that annoying hourglass issue is back. Quake 2 also runs, barely. Even at the lowest resolution, it just isn't very playable, but at least we don't have to stare at that hourglass again. Expendable is completely broken on this card, with only the HUD elements and a few flashing particles showing. This was the case even when trying the newer 1.30 drivers. It's just a no-go on this card. Alien vs. Predator is even more broken. The only thing you can see is the fraps counter in the corner. But fortunately, our pain will be relieved momentarily when this game crashes to the desktop. But can it run Unreal? Well, I'm sure you can probably guess, but yeah, the frame rate is less than half that of the reference card. I will say the image quality is actually pretty decent if it weren't a bit too dark. Alright, so what can we conclude from everything we've just seen? Well, on the positive side, the card is mostly feature complete, with many games rendering almost perfectly, with maybe a few compromises in quality. And if the game is old enough, frame rates are quite good, even kind of playable at 640 by 480 in some cases. And thanks to our AOpen driver, we have beta OpenGL support, which is a nice extra. The negatives are that 640 by 480 is generally too much for this card. Fog support is either broken or just missing. The beta OpenGL support is limited to Windows 9X and with only one particular driver, and you do get some rendering issues from time to time. Newer games released towards the tail end of the card's life just don't run well, or even at all. In the end, we give the SIS 6326 a score of 5 out of 10 for being the best of the worst, so to say, among the cards we've tested in this series. Image quality is generally comparable to better cards, but overall speed is just too slow for us to recommend for retro gaming, despite it being cheap and easy to find. There's simply much better options out there to consider. That will do it for this edition of Worst Game Graphics Cards. After the last episode on the Alliance AT3D, the SAS 6326 was honestly a breath of fresh air, as I'm sure you'll agree. We thank you very much for watching, and as always, we leave you with the 3D Mark 99 demo, happily running pretty decently this time. Take care,